in many ways, I feel like a feather being blown in the wind because, like I'll learn about some new approach. I don't know what I want to do, and I'm not supposed to say that out in public, but my skills were getting deeper and deeper, but narrower and narrower, and that just felt frustrating to me because I like having my fingers dipped in lots of different areas and thinking from different approaches. I've had experiences that I'm the only person ever in the history of the world to have had that experience just sitting in my little lab alone. It's like, oh, it's real. I'm hearing the exact pattern of a neuron that is somehow related to the cognitive function that I'm interested in. I had to think like, do I really want to sacrifice my happiness for this career, or can I do, something else? I don't care about my legacy. And I think if
Huh.
you care about your legacy, it's going to drive you to be in that more competitive kind of
Uh-huh.
space. We sold our house, we sold all of our belongings, we kept the children, and we bought an RV, yeah, and then moved the whole family into the RV and then just started roaming around the country. That's one thing that has only increased throughout my career is knowing how little I know and being super comfortable because I know no one knows anything.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Love and Philosophy Beyond Dichotomy, which just means we're trying to get past traditional divides without disrespecting them or trying to smush them together. Just talk about differences beyond the differences. And today is a special episode with someone who really helped me do that. His name is Paul Middlebrooks. When I was in school for neuroscience, I found a podcast that had just started called Brain Inspired. That's Paul's podcast, and it really helped me. It was almost a better teacher than some of my actual classes in neuroscience. So this is a gratitude episode to Paul and to his podcast. But it's also about what that podcast has been about these past years since 2018 when it started, which for me is about holding the paradox. Isn't everything about that? I'm just kidding, but actually we do talk about that a bit here because just one example, I started listening to Paul's podcast because I needed to learn about machine learning and I wanted to learn about AI, and there weren't many podcasts about that, and he was doing that in the context of neuroscience. At that time, I was very interested in ecological ways of thinking about philosophy and psychology and the 4 E's, so to speak. He was not. And at some point, as I've been listening to his podcast, he's become very interested in those sorts of things, as he says here, especially ecological psychology. And of course, I've learned a lot about computation and machine learning. So I think that represents something that's happening in a lot of nested layers across the sciences, where we're opening to one another in a way that doesn't cancel out what we care about. It's hard to do. Comes through in a lot of ways that we use words like computation, representation. Of course, there's still tons of fights about that. And as Paul says here, it's still used in a really particular way in most of neuroscience. I won't go into all that here, but I do think Paul's podcast and what we discuss here does relate to a lot of other themes in the other episodes, where we're trying to open the space and understand how there can be computation and representation, even if it doesn't mean that it's necessarily in the process that we're studying. So that's all a bit nuanced, but Paul and I talk about it from his point of view. Also, I think something important about Paul and his podcast is just thinking of education differently. Yes, now everyone seems to have a podcast, and there's lots of learning online. And I guess for people who started podcasts long ago, that can be annoying. But in another way, you don't really do it unless you want to do it, and it doesn't last unless it's giving something. It seems like there's a new way in which we're thinking about what education is and when we can learn. There's a lot of people who go back to school at different ages now for different things. Like me, I'm one of them. I went back for neuroscience in my 30s, and that used to not be so common. But I think it's becoming very common that we learn for a whole life, that we maybe change what we do in our life. Paul is a good example of that. He did it at a time when it could have seemed dangerous from an academic point of view to stop after your postdoc and when you're right in the middle of everything and travel across the country and create a podcast. But it's turned out well for him, as you'll hear. So this is really a conversation about how within neuroscience we may be beginning to hold what seemed like binaries not too long ago, whether that's AI and technology and cognition or embodied in ecological processes and computationalism, but also in our own lives, how we're starting to open to a different idea of what education might be, that it might be a lifelong process for some of us. Process is a big word here. At some point we talk about Mark Bickhard, and I say Burkhard because I always say Burkhard, but it's Bickhard. He's talking a lot about mind as process and process metaphysics. Paul had him on the show and Brain Inspired. I'll link to some of this in the show notes. But main point of this show is to say thank you to Paul and to so many others who put so much time into learning and sharing what they're learning with us. It's also about what I hope we can do, those of us who care about neuroscience and philosophy, from whatever angle, whatever we're doing, whatever title we call ourselves or are called, that we can open the space a little bit around some of these labels that have been constrictive and find something very exciting is actually happening for all of us. And I hope that's also true for you, wherever you are, whatever you're studying, whatever you care about. And I send you good wishes, love, and philosophy right now. I also just want to say thank you to the people who've reached out and shared this podcast with me and helped and given support. It's so meaningful to me. I can't even express it, how much it means to feel your support and to learn from you too. So thank you for your support on the Substack, on YouTube, on the podcast platforms. Thank you for your emails. Thank you for everything, anywhere that you've supported this. I read everything and I take it all to heart, and thank you. Hi, Paul. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for doing this today.
You as well, Andrea. Thanks for reaching out.
So I think you started your podcast, Brain Inspired, in 2018. Is that right?
That sounds about right.
Around about then, right?
Around about then.
I looked kind of for your first episodes, and I think they were around 2018. Maybe with Stephen Potter. What does that sound like, the first one?
Man, you really did. You really have done your research. Yes.
Yes, of course I did.
It is because he had written a paper specifically about how neuroscience could help AI. And this is like right when I was getting into this kind of topic. And so it just seemed like a good place to start. And he was gracious with his time.
Yeah. Well, what I'm thinking of is 2018 to 2024 in terms of AI has been kind of crazy whirlwind. Does it feel like a totally different world or from when you started in terms of AI and neuroscience?
Yeah, it does. And I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about my path or whatever, but
definitely.
I've become of two minds about the use. So what I was really interested in is using artificial intelligence to help better understand our cognition, our minds, and our brains. And with the explosion of it, and with my own learning more, some philosophical background and some outlooks, some alternative metaphors for how we think, I have become less enamored with the use of artificial intelligence as a tool to study the mind brain, although I still think it's quite useful. But this is a time when neuroscience is very enamored with it. And it's the tool du jour, I suppose, at least in the computational neurosciences, in terms of modeling different brain areas and functions.
I like it that you use the word enamored because there's the root of love is in there. And I think I've heard you maybe in your podcast talk about neuroscience or academia, but especially neuroscience, having almost a relationship with AI where it's kind of on again, off again, or whatever. And so it makes sense to me actually that after having spent 6 years really looking into every little thing and seeing it all happen, that you would be a little ahead of kind of the love curve, so to speak. Do you know what I mean?
At the forefront of it?
Yeah, like everyone else is still falling in love maybe, or getting to know it.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
It hasn't evened out.
I think I've come to appreciate biological processes more and process more, as opposed to the static computer information processing metaphor. And I can't articulate it yet, and that's one of the reasons why I continue to, do the podcast and try to learn more. But intuitively, now it's intuitive. I feel that there are important things going on with, for example, embodiment and the flow of, I was going to say information, but that's kind of a dirty term, the
Mm.
flow of
Mhm.
our cognitive processes, our brain processes, and that continuum, which is very different than the static computational approach,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
exactly. Yeah, it does make sense. And this is a very big topic, and it's something you address very well in your episodes, mostly with the way that you've gone about discovering the idea of process and with your interviews with Bickhard, for example, and that kind of exploration. But because it can be a really hard thing to talk about in neuroscience, especially computation and AI oriented neuroscience, because there seems to be this dichotomy, especially in
It,
terms of something like computation and process, or you mind
yeah,
and brain, or these kind of things. So it can be tricky to use these words in these very specific contexts that might think you're going over to the other side. I don't know. Does that make sense?
it
In term,
does.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle, and it's a mighty struggle.
Mm-hmm.
If I am kind of enamored by a process philosophical approach now, what does that change about the way that I'm doing science? And it's nothing so far. It's just the outlook, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although it has allowed me to interpret some of my data differently, but the data are still the same data. And I'm in a uh, state space, and we use dynamical systems theory as well. So that's toward process, but we still talk about everything as a state, as a representation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how does, for example, motor cortex compute uh, behavior? So we still use these terms that I'm headed further away from, but then I'm still embracing them because they're used in our current paradigm in neuroscience. One must publish, and they do lend purchase to how to think about how our cognitive functions occur. So it's a struggle because I don't know if we're naturally dichotomous thinkers, if that's just a human bug, or maybe it's a feature. I'm not sure, but it's very difficult to sort of go between the two, I find. And it sounds like you, I mean, are interested in this as well. I mean, Beyond Dichotomies is on your website. So
Yeah, and it's really kind of the name of all this in a way. Because I think to your point that you were just making, that it has been really important. So I'm not trying to reject it, because I think it's actually an important tool. And maybe it relates more to why something like computation or AI can be very important. I think maybe in one of your more recent conversations, the one about the abstraction in the brain, um,
must be
there's
to Chiramuta, probably.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Then there's this another thing I think about a lot is how we confuse map and territory and things like this. It feels like in neuroscience, whether it's with Buzaki questioning the words we used, or there's a million ways in which people are starting to try to understand that the way we speak about those terms you just said, for example, like representations in the brain as if they're static, coming from that computational lineage and model, that's not quite right, but it doesn't mean we reject them. That's what I mean by sort of holding the paradox. You've probably gotten yourself into a place where you can do that. With your research now, you can probably hold that space without having to reject it one way or the other. You can probably see, oh, this is the way they're seeing representation. This is the way they're seeing it. But I don't think that's an easy or natural holding of space.
Well, I don't
Or
know
what do
that
you?
I'm very good at it yet. But for example, I was listening to your episode with Inez Hippolito, I believe is how you pronounce her name. And I was really surprised that she rejected the idea that you could live with both sides of, that coin in the same. She was kind of staunchly saying that you have to choose one and be in that lane. And that's uncomfortable.
I think she kind of came around to a
Did she,
different way by the end in a way, because I
you
think
kept pushing her.
within, well, but that's the weird thing, right? Where you hold the paradox, because within the world she's in, which I know very well, and you've probably got some good understanding of it too in philosophy, where you really kind of almost feel like you have to choose between the so-called analytic and the so-called embodied.
Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
nobody really has to choose. You can't choose, and that's the point we're trying to get to. But I think when you push people and they're in that world, they're used to reacting in that certain way. So it's almost like we have to widen kind of what we mean by the terms, which I think is what she and I did together in that conversation a bit. And by the end, it wasn't clear that you had to make a choice necessarily. But yeah, let's get to you though and think about your kind of path relative to this, and then come back to some of this holding the paradox and dichotomy, because you started out back in, let's say, whatever year it was, let's go to 2016 or something. You were very much in academia, right? You were, where
Yeah,
were you? You'd
I
done your
was
PhD
at
and
at that point. I was on my first postdoc.
okay.
I got my PhD in 2011, maybe.
I'm terrible with
2006.
numbers,
Yeah,
so it doesn't
yeah,
matter.
me
But
too.
you started on this road. Actually, I have to say, you first were very interested in philosophy, I know from your podcast. And then I just found out you studied aerospace engineering first, which
Oh, well,
kind of
that's
blew
just
my
why
mind.
everyone. That's the. I mean, yeah. I mean, I didn't stay in aerospace that long, only two
Okay,
years.
okay. But that was the
Um,
first.
yeah, and I didn't get like flunk out of it or anything, but it just wasn't. It wasn't what I thought it would be. You know. So then I switched to, molecular biology is what I ended up getting my undergraduate degree in. But you said I began interested or studying philosophy, which I think that maybe the book that got me interested in neuroscience was the book Neurophilosophy from
Patricia
Patricia
Churchland.
Churchland. Um, and looking, well, I don't know, but even in I took a few years after getting my undergraduate degree before and started working in a couple labs. I worked in a molecular biology wet lab. Then down the hall, there was this developmental visual cortex neuroscience lab. And I ended up transferring to that lab and working as a research tech.
Oh,
And that kind of got me a little bit more into the neuroscience in itself, right? And so I never really studied philosophy. It's always been an interest, but I have not studied it nearly as deeply.
I didn't mean you would started in academia and philosophy. Here's what I meant to say. You were interested in cognition or the mind or something relative to
Yes,
all these themes early on, like maybe even before you went to university, as I understand it.
yeah. Oh, I mean, I wanted to understand consciousness. That's like
Right.
that's like the
Consciousness. Yeah.
the main thing. What it is, how it occurs,
Do
nature
you
of
remember when
consciousness.
you first, is there any memory where you were thinking about that, where you, I mean, I've talked about it before with others where I remember, the first time someone in my family passed away, for example, when I was a kid, and kind of having this like, oh,
Oh,
what is it going on here? Kind of moment of recognition that there is such a thing as consciousness and I can be aware of it with my own consciousness. Some kind of weird meta moment. Do you have any of those or even things you read maybe like
I
early?
don't for me, but I have a son who, when he was, um, oh, I don't know, 4 maybe, he said one day like that he just understood that other people had minds separately from
Oh,
him.
wow.
So he
So
like
he had it.
realized, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I got to see him have that
Oh,
moment.
wow. What
Oh,
was that
like,
like to see him have that, especially?
oh, it was so well, first of all, I thought like, you're just now having that.
He's four
And
though.
and I know, well, I don't know if he was
Yeah.
actually 4. I'm bad with numbers,
Okay.
but
So
but
am
then I
I, so
thought
it
that is
doesn't.
like such a cool realization, and I'm not sure he felt how cool it was. I think I
Mm.
might have felt it more than he did, but to have that realization, you only get to have that once. So it was really beautiful to see. I'm still waiting on my daughter, who's older than him, for that realization. No,
She
no,
probably had it long, long ago, and when she was born, she already knew.
or probably so. She's very intentional. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
but you're right. That's kind of the thing we're trying to understand in a way, isn't it? Like, how does your son have that realization? I know you worked with metacognition some too, and there's this, I mean, what do we really mean by consciousness? And is it the same thing as cognition? And I wanted to actually get into that a little bit with you, but let's bracket it for just a second, unless you have something you
Sure.
want to say, because I do wonder. So you were at least curious about all of these things. Of course, we're orienting it all in a certain way. But as you found yourself in neuroscience going towards this through all these other ways, was it something you were still trying to, was it still motivating the interest in that?
Well, you
Yeah.
mentioned, so I ended up developing in graduate school for my PhD thesis. I went into graduate school thinking like, how can I study consciousness? But
Okay.
the lab that I ended up joining was a non-human primate lab. So in the vast majority of studies of consciousness and higher cognitive function have been in humans and still is. So I was like, how can I study, like, what is the highest cognitive function I can study in non-human primates? And we happen to be recording in various cortical areas. So with the help of my very kind advisor who let me do this essentially and encouraged me, we developed a task that tested monkeys' metacognitive abilities and then measured brain activity while they were doing this task. And then lo and behold, in some cortical areas, there's a difference in neural activity when the monkey was performing metacognitively well versus when it was performing poorly. So like when it seemed to be aware of what it was doing versus when it seemed to be just doing it without being aware of it. So that's the very dirty version of my PhD thesis. And then I realized, I didn't know anything still. I mean, I didn't know that the rich, historical literature. So this was based in decision making. And there's this rich historical literature that I connected with in the PhD level, kind of rode upon to help develop the experimental task and the questions.
Mm-hmm.
But I still had a lot to learn in terms of the raw neuroscience and cognitive science of decision making. So I ended up, like many people, I started ambitious and wide, big questions, and then you learn how little you know, and then you get a little bit narrower. So then I started studying like specific type of decision making. And so the questions were just got narrower and narrower as I went. So I'm not sure that the science itself was hard enough, and the basic science questions were hard enough and unknown enough that became more interesting, not more interesting, tangible. Because you're going to ask me about cognition and consciousness and what it is, and it's embarrassing. It's just embarrassing.
I was going to ask you, have you gotten any closer to figuring out what it is?
But not really. In many ways, I feel like a feather being blown in the wind, because like I'll learn about some new approach. Like recently, I've been learning more about ecological psychology, which even has like a different definition for what mind is and mindedness is.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming once you are too curious.
Well, yeah, but that's why you have to hold paradoxes together.
And that's the practice we're all trying to learn in some weird way, as we are able to absorb the fact that there are more and more ways of coming at something like the term consciousness or mind or cognition.
But it can be an obstacle as well, because if you take on one viewpoint, you're going to go down that road as far as you want to go, and you can get really deep. And especially if you have like blinders on to other interpretations of what you're doing, you're going to have academic success. I'm not sure if it's satisfying outside of, your career, maybe legacy, I guess. But it can be, as soon as I get a result, right, then I have to think, oh, now how do I think about this from a process philosophy perspective? How do I think about this from an ecological psychology perspective?
Most people would rather not think about them. It's too much of a computational explosion of the brain or something.
Yeah. Well, then we just go to the bars,
Yeah. Well, and then I don't. But I have to stop here because this is fascinating and something I think a lot of people are trying to deal with in a way. So you started with these really big questions, which I think a lot of us do, especially those of us with philosophical proclivity, right? And I think they still inspire a lot of work. Quite a few neuroscientists that I know are very successful people in science, let's say, not necessarily even just neuroscientists, but it's the big questions that got them into it. And then, like you said, you find yourself getting more and more detailed, because that's the process of science, that you're refining your question and you're getting the parameters set such that you can, and it can seem, if you want to have success in a way, you do narrow it down. Let's say you're going to go into a certain kind of decision making, and you're going to read all those papers and you're going to be in that lineage, and you almost have to block out the other stuff, because it's just, how could you possibly read all the papers and all the,
you can't.
It's a narrowing that's almost necessary.
It's a narrowing, but a deepening as well, because otherwise you're just at the surface of everything.
But then there's this way in which, when you still think about that big question and what motivates you, you can, and people have this now where you feel like, what have I done, right? I've narrowed everything down. It ain't easy.
For some people, it is. And it's amazing to me that, so I mean, I think that I have this genetically, because my father never knew what he wanted to do, and he had like a long career. And I don't know what I want to do. And I'm not supposed to say that out in public, but like my current advisor and the woman who I was just speaking with when I was recording an episode before we're recording this, they both knew like really early on. and we're interested in very specific things. And I don't know what that feels like.
They knew like, okay, I'm going to study this area of the brain or something. Is that what you mean? Or
Um,
this question
behavior,
about,
like behavior
yeah.
in general, like how our brains enact behavior. And that's more tangible. Like in the case of, I was just talking with Karen Adolph, it was development and how development of behavior um, undergirds our cognition and how cognition develops through studying infants and their, development. So those are more directed questions than I want to figure
What
out
is consciousness?
consciousness. Yeah. I
That's
mean,
true. Good point.
yeah.
However, I would say even at that scale, I think these are nested things. Of course, we're talking as philosophers, so to speak. I know you are a neuroscientist, but you have this philosophical spirit in a sense, right? That's what
Okay.
we were
That's a good
talking
way to
about.
put it. Yeah.
But even within their field, if you ask that question, you're still going to have to make decisions about which side of this or that you're going to
Oh,
be
philosophy?
on. No, in the behavior
Oh, yeah.
realm. If you take that scale, you're still, it's not that you're narrowing in the sense that it's a bad word, but you're going to have to make certain decisions and go down a certain path. And that's not
That's right.
wrong, but you can end up with the same feeling of, if I try to explore this now, it looks like it goes against this whole lineage that I've dedicated my life to. Therefore, I don't look at it, which is actually probably what needs to happen. But at different scales, and maybe that's why we have philosophers or podcasters, we want to know how it all links together. And at that level, you have to start doing some of this work, which you've been doing, I guess, since 2018, where you do try to look at what are the patterns connecting this, and you go pretty deep into everything, which is quite time consuming, but yeah, you find a way to try to do this and hold this space, or at least open a space where people can talk about it and it can be seen. So let's get to how you did that in this time period before you created the podcast. Why didn't you just go down the path of academia? What was it?
Uh, so I was feeling frustrated. I guess I was in maybe my fourth or fifth year as a postdoc, and my skills were getting deeper and deeper, but narrower and narrower, and that just felt frustrating to me because I like having my fingers dipped in lots of different areas and thinking
Mhm.
from different approaches. Let me
Yeah.
just back up, and it's just because I was just speaking with her, but
Mm-hmm.
Kara and Adolf had this experience in, I think, graduate school where she learned about ecological psychology. And it's like, boom,
Mm-hmm.
she knew that was exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I think she phrased it like, it was like God opening up to her or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have that kind of experience, but some people do.
I
So
kind of had
anyway,
that with philosophy, which it
what does he mean?
opened up.
Philosophy in general?
Yeah, in my first philosophy class, literally, where I realized you can think about these things. I won't say like the skies opened up or something, but I've had these moments in life. I don't know if you've had them where you just know there something important is happening just because of the physical effect it's having. It almost feels like everything's lined up a little bit. Not to get too mystical, but it's almost like a
Because
great sports experience or something. But you're like, oh, something is happening here. If I pay attention to it, it's going to open something up. It could be with a relationship too, but or
yeah,
book. Yeah.
yeah. But so what was your first philosophy course? Was it epistemology?
It was more like a philosophy of mind, but it was very the professor who taught it did it in a very beautiful way where it
Oh,
wasn't
that helps. Yeah.
analytical. It was looking at what mind is, kind of broader, taking all beyond dichotomy in a way, like looking
Yeah.
at many different forms of philosophy and thinking about it. Okay, so you
So
didn't have
yeah,
an aha moment or whatever in terms
for my
of your
career.
work.
Yeah, yeah. So I was actually feeling so I had this narrow skill set, but it's actually quite narrow. Non-human primate neurophysiology, decision making. And it was
Yeah.
like all that with psychophysics as well, like analyzing the behavior. So I had kind of had to make a decision. I couldn't be a postdoc forever. But I wasn't that excited about the area that I was immersed in.
Hmm.
Um, and so I had to figure out, am I going to look for a different postdoc? Am I going to try to search for faculty positions, feeling terribly unconfident and, on some level incompetent
Hmm.
to start running my own lab? And I mean, this is sort of a personal side about it because, I was using non-human primate research and that was mentally tough to do.
It wears on you, and when you're gonna dedicate your research and life to it. It's, whoa.
Yeah, yeah. It's also hard,
Yeah.
and takes a lot of lab. Uh, you have to jump through a lot of hoops in lab, and there's a lot of caretaking involved, and so there was that aspect as well.
It's a total sidetrack, but I know when you were doing this work, you were having to record single neurons, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was that like? What do you do
Oh.
to record a single neuron? Because
Oh.
can you just phenomenologically explain it in a way? Like what do you like doing? Because you were doing it every day, right? Recording.
Yes.
And I think
Yeah.
about it
So
a
the
lot, but I never really know how to picture it exactly. I've never watched someone do it. I keep meaning to go in the
oh
lab and actually do it, but I haven't.
oh, this would be good because I have a moment I can tell you about.
Okay.
And a lot of neurophysiologists have this moment. But
Okay.
first, the experimental setup is basically you do a surgery and implant like a chronic uh, chamber where you want to record your neurons from. And then every day you bring the organism into the lab and you lower. This is the way people used to do it and still do it with like single neurons because the technology's gotten a lot better. But you lower an electrode into the brain and you're listening. So you're putting the electronic signal, the voltage signal, through an oscilloscope and through an audio monitor.
I
And
see.
so you're going down and it's kind of silent. And then all of a sudden you start hearing pop, and you're
Yeah.
hearing the action potentials of single neurons or small groups of neurons. And in my case, so I'm not sure, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I've seen those before. You mean it almost looks like a little cap that the
Yeah.
creature's wearing
Yeah.
or something, and then I guess I meant so you're removed from it.
You don't sit
You
in
know,
lab like the,
yeah.
so organism is in a different room. You're in the computer side
Yeah.
about 5 feet away on the other side of like a thick curtain.
Okay.
In my case, animals sitting in a dark room because we're tracking where their eye movement location, where their eye movements are, location of their eye movements are. Because in my case, we were showing like dots on the screen, and on every single trial, first off, a central fixation spot comes up, like a little light in the center, and the monkey in this case would start a trial by fixating on that central
Mm,
fixation dot, and then the game of the trial would begin, and it would indicate its decisions based on which target it moved its eyes to.
I see.
And we we were recording from multiple areas, but one of the areas we were recording from is called frontal eye field, and it's famous for having eye movement related activity. So, so we're recording their eye, we're tracking their eye position at the same time as we're listening to neurons. So you're driving the electrode down, and then all of a sudden, and the monkey's like doing tasks while you're doing it, and then all of a sudden you hear neural activity locked onto the time of when the animal makes an eye movement, makes a decision.
So the
So
beats
you
are like beep 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 beep, beep or something. Like a
go,
hippo is like a place cell kind of like a Geiger cat
no, it's more
counter kind of stuff.
it more ramps up. So it's like
Oh,
whoosh,
okay.
whoosh.
Okay.
So that was the moment. A lot of neurophysiologists have this moment where you're hearing brain activity and seeing it on a screen, and it is related to monkey making an eye movement in this case. And it's I don't know. I, I've never even heard it described well. It's just something that you don't forget. It's almost magical to hear
Is it
for the
because
first
you
time.
can you try to for someone who doesn't know why, is it that kind of same, I mean, because I just said it, it reminds me of the lining up of when I'm sitting in the philosophy class and certain ideas I've been thinking about are expressed in a certain way, and there's a kind of alignment or something that happens where I don't know. Does it feel like that? Yeah.
It's somehow about like, oh, I am listening in on cognition. I'm
You're
not,
the only one who knows that or something secret kind of.
oh, yeah, well, that happens all the time where, so I've had experiences that I'm the only person ever in the history of the world to have had that experience just sitting in my little lab alone. I mean, not profound experiences, but that happens a lot to people in lab because of, whatever accidents, or accidental happiness happens that day, right?
You're looking for something or you don't maybe know exactly what you're looking for, and then suddenly it's there in a way, or you're witnessing it, so to speak. Is it
Well,
that kind
in this case, it was just like a feeling that kind of you get chills
of
because you're connecting like actual brain activity, which is what at the time I thought was doing everything, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's changed a little bit, but you're seeing it in real time, hearing it in real time. And it's just, it's like, oh, it's real. We have brains and they are active. I'm hearing the exact pattern of a neuron that is somehow related to the cognitive function that I'm interested in.
It
So
reminds
that's,
me
yeah,
of people saying when they are trying to work on a math problem and they finally figure out a little thing. And it's
yeah,
not that it's so great that they figured it out. It's like, oh my God, it actually will work.
yes. And or like if you're, I don't know if you are a musician, but if you're like trying to write a song or trying to write a poem, or in your case, a book, right? You probably have
Mm.
those moments all the time where you're like, ah, I figured out the structure of how I want to do this. And, musicians are famous for saying that those ideas kind of fall out at a given point. You work really, really hard and then are kind of given to you. So it's somewhat like that feeling, but I didn't work for it so much.
But a lot of people did. I mean, you're part of it.
Yes.
But I think I'm not a musician, but I've been around a lot of musicians and in my life. And I'm still trying to relate it to, I think, the story of your guest. And there's this kind of way in which things align and it makes sense or something. And it's not that it feels bigger than you at the same time. And yet so much work has gone into it that, there's also kind of like yeah, a success feeling to it. But
Yeah, but that's wrapped up in the history of it as well. I think
exactly.
you're,
That's what I mean. As you sitting in that little room, you're part of something bigger than you in a way that,
oh yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And you feel that probably in the moment, right? A bit. And also kind of,
oh
it's
yeah.
like, oh, this is actually what I've been doing. It's real what other people say or something.
And then you have the experience. I was talking about experiencing my son's moment a few
Mm,
moments ago. Then you have the experience of when a new student comes in the lab and sees that for the first time. You know what they're experiencing, and you see,
mm,
how it affects them.
mm.
And then your advisor went through the same thing, and he told you the same story about like the first time he heard a neuron. And there's so many
Yeah.
people who have that experience.
In a way, that's probably the more the motivation too. Because just to go to your music example, I think a lot of music is actually kind of like that too, because we fall in love with other musicians. I'm not a musician again. I could speak it of his writing too, but music is just so immediate.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah,
I,
you fall in
I
love
know what
with
you're gonna
music
say.
because yeah.
Yeah.
What?
Are you gonna say, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
I'm imagining, I'm predicting what you're gonna say is that you
Say,
start out by
predict.
imitating your heroes. Uh,
Yeah, or wanting
and,
to give other people the feeling that they gave you.
oh yeah, okay. Well, that's not what I was gonna say. So,
Yeah. But no, it's
yeah.
connected to what you're going to say too, because you're imitating them and you want so much to have those moments that feel kind of magical, right? But
And
maybe
in your own
you
voice.
haven't. And then it clicks and it's like, oh, this is real. It's similar to the lineage thing we were just describing in science, because then somehow you've connected. You're part of it. Like whatever that person had experienced, now you have, and it's as if you've opened up some kind of a lineage or line or flow, and you know it's real, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my case, I'm not there yet with music, but I can jive with you on the science part of it for sure.
So there's these moments, it's beautiful in science, but it somehow, when you were going to decide, are you going to do all the work to start your own lab and be the person spearheading all this, doing the grants, all of that kind of stuff, the
Yeah.
answer back then was no.
It was
And
a pretty hard no at some
yeah.
point. I mean, you also, as a postdoc especially, you're getting kind of close to that point, and there are new faculty members that you see, and they're always running down the hall, sweating, and they never seem happy because they're working so hard because they need to get
Yeah, yeah, it's
tenure
so
and stuff. So,
stressful.
so I had to think like, do I really want to sacrifice my happiness for this career, or can I do, something else?
Hmm.
At least for now, you know, I don't. It's also when you walk away from academia, I, the feeling is that it's going to be hard to get back into it because you
Hmm.
need to maintain a paper trail of publications, and no one's
Hmm.
going to want you if you've
Hmm.
been away for a while and stuff.
Hmm.
So that it was a hard choice, but in my heart, it was the right choice.
Can you tell me about deciding to stop and what you decided to do instead? Was it just, okay, I'm just going to stop? And how did the podcast come? And how does that
Yeah.
connect? Were you already thinking, well, I still want to continue all this. How can I continue all this in a way that feels more, yeah, in that space that's more natural to you, of maybe questioning it and looking from this wider point of view?
Oh, Andrew, you're telling my story for me. I appreciate that.
Am I?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, a little bit, but okay. Well, let me go back and say one thing in terms of how I was feeling about whether I should continue or not. I don't care about my legacy. And I think if
huh,
you care about your legacy, it's going to drive you to be in that more competitive kind of
uh-huh.
space. And a lot of people I admire care very deeply about their legacy, and it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
not me. So that was another factor.
That's a really big statement. You really don't care at all about your legacy. By legacy, you mean in science, or you mean you
Yes,
don't
yeah, yeah.
care?
My
Okay.
scientific, well, I don't care about my
By
government
that, you
side. I
mean you
care.
don't care what other people think of you? Is that
I
kind
just
of?
don't care about being remembered.
Huh.
I just I don't think it's a helpful way to move through life. But I think that is a big motivator for people. So in some sense, I do wish I care, and I'm probably being dishonest on some level. Like I'm just telling myself that story. But why would I start a podcast if I didn't care about
Well,
being
maybe
remembered or
you
something?
care
But
about, I mean, this is very idealistic, but maybe you care more about what you leave behind, which is different from people remembering you, or what
no, I think
you give.
I
Yeah. Or maybe you're
I
just narcissistic and you just want to do what you want to do.
I think it's closer to that, unfortunately. If
Okay.
I think it might be like I mean, really, there are two most rewarding things about having started the podcast, and we can backtrack and talk about that transition. Things that I didn't think about. The reason I started the podcast in general is I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn at a certain level, like, because there were like a bunch of popular podcasts, popular science podcasts, but they weren't kind of going deep enough for me. And I loved,
Mm.
like, as I was learning more, I would listen to these things. I told you Brain Science podcast by
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ginger Campbell was a
Yeah.
super early major influence on me. And she did such a fantastic job of explaining, asking clarification questions. And I still enjoyed her podcast, but I wanted to explore the topics a little more deeply without having to explain all of the very basic assumptions. And that means I automatically would alienate a lot of uh, potential audience. But what I found, and these are the two things that have been like the most wonderful thing, is just the gratitude listeners feel for the podcast. I get like so many people come up, and it's not something that I was anticipating, but they're so thankful, and I'm getting chills right now just thinking about it, and having some sort of positive impact on people's lives in that regard.
Mm.
It's amazing. It is amazing, and it's not something that I thought about that would happen. The other thing is just this is going to sound like sort of businessy, but it's the network of friendly acquaintances and friends that I have made from the guests that have come on the show. Like this probably won't be the last time you and I chat. I hope it's not.
No.
And we're going to probably, unless I ruin things, we'll probably end on pretty good terms today. I hope.
Yeah.
But that's also something that I wasn't anticipating is I have like this awesome network now because of doing the podcast.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was getting at a bit. I don't know what the state of podcasting was at the time you started it exactly, because
Oh, now it's
yeah,
just
now
everyone
everybody
has a
has a
podcast now,
podcast.
right? I'm not,
Yeah,
yeah,
including
no
me.
offense. And I'm not,
No,
yeah,
I
yeah,
take no offense. I
yeah.
like it, but back then, which wasn't that long ago, but feels like decades ago in terms of things like AI and neuroscience and podcasting, there was no other deep going into like podcasts about issues of AI and neuroscience, and not everyone was doing podcasting. And so I can't imagine you were just sitting there thinking, oh, what I'll do is quit academia and start a podcast that's going to be successful, and
Oh,
then therefore
yeah,
get meet
you
this
had,
wonderful network and have people who appreciate what I'm giving to them in the world. Maybe you thought that. I don't know. Maybe they
oh, I thought, oh, I want to be an influencer.
did you?
No, I didn't. No, no, of course not. No, so by the end of my first postdoc, because I'm now in a second postdoc, um,
With a big
the
gap in between, though, we should
with
say.
a big gap,
Yeah.
in between, um, the AI using using machine learning models and loosely calling it AI models, using connectionist type networks was just becoming like kind of a big thing
Mm.
in computational and cognitive neuroscience. And I didn't know anything about it. Like I knew things very superficially. And so I thought, this is super interesting. And I'd already made the decision to leave academia. And so, of course, I did a search for podcasts on the intersection, and none existed. And I thought, well, I eventually thought, well, I want to make what I would want to hear. And
Mm.
so that's literally what it came from, and wanting to learn more about it and have, learn from the people who are doing that kind of work. My podcast has evolved since then, since that early kind of vision. But sometimes artificial intelligence is not even mentioned in an episode, right? And the
Right.
original Envision was all about the intersection of neuroscience and artificial intelligence. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So it's kind
that's
of
how I
almost
started.
cognitive science, or I know
I don't,
like tricky
yeah,
term to use, but sometimes because there's always a connection, it's just that a lot of it sometimes is assumed. So I have to go back to what I started with at the beginning. That was a really fortuitous choice to make at that exact moment in a way, right? That you saw that there was a kind of convergence coming because this was before, I mean, deep learning was getting deeper.
yeah.
I
Deep
mean,
learning was the term I should have used. Yeah,
but there wasn't this large language model, crazy stuff. Nobody had thought of the transformer architecture and so on and so forth. So you rode that wave. That's what I
I
was
don't know
saying.
if
In a
it.
way, you kind of
Yeah,
already can see it from a different place than others because, yeah, it
maybe,
was just beginning.
maybe so. Yeah, I mean, like anything, there was already really kind of a fairly rich history of using these models to study cognitive functions, but it was just becoming more and more seemingly useful. And overlapping, and that you could reliably use a deep learning model set up in the right way to model various parts of how, for example, our visual cortex works. Um, and I mean, we can get into some of that alignment is very superficial, and some of it is really awesome that you can predict a neuron's activity based on what the model says. With
Yeah.
4 layers, 4 layers deep in visual cortex, you can predict how a neuron will be activated um, based on fitting the model to like the whole neural data set. So it's really quite impressive still. But because of the nature of um, the topics and the depth and I'm okay getting into like technical discussions on the podcast, and sometimes
Hmm.
I ask fairly detailed questions, because it's kind of alienates, let's say, the lay population. It has had it's continued to grow, but it's been like slow, steady growth, and it's not like I exploded in. I'm not like a podcast land superstar or something like that. So it's,
Well, but you made a big difference. I'm one of the people who learned a lot, has learned a lot, and continues to
me
learn a
too.
lot
Me
from
too.
your. Well, see, yeah, exactly. So maybe it was an accident or maybe not, but you actually found a way to be what to do what one might have done had you stayed in the academic world in a way that fit to your whatever, your energy
Oh,
or self in a way. But I want to get it. Well, how were you brave enough to do that? How were you brave enough to quit academia? And I feel like you moved across the country or something. And
yeah.
tell me.
I think my prefrontal cortex is still not fully developed, I think is the real answer here. Um, my
Well,
wife and I, once I came to so I was married and had two very small children uh, at the time of this potential transition. And so we had a lot of discussions. My wife is in sort of the wellness sector. She used to be a yoga instructor, and so she's gone down a few different roads. And we came up with the idea. So first of all, we sold our house. We sold all of our belongings. We kept the children, and we bought an RV, and then moved the whole family into the RV, and then just started roaming around the country, which was a lot of fun, also a lot of work. But while we were doing that, neither of us was employed anymore, and we focused on starting an online business for essentially my wife. So the plan was to get her online business going, start getting some income from that, and I would figure out what the hell I was going to do. And so I came up with the idea of the podcast, but I also I need to update it or get rid of it now. But I made an online course eventually about the topics. So that was
uh,
kind of the vision for Brain Inspired too, was to have some kind of income, coming through
I see.
that as well. So we were, that sounds all very simple. We had a half plan. And also this was a time when online business was becoming more and more normal. And so we thought we would give this a try to not have to be tethered to a location. I mean, post COVID, this is like standard now or something, but
Right.
not
Yeah.
have to be
But
tied
it
to a
wasn't then.
location,
Yeah.
have our own um, income from our own businesses. And so Brain Inspired, started as kind of a shot in the dark in terms of like, can this become something? Can I make it into something, a recurring, a livable income? So we were working like crazy, living in this RV with a 2 and a 4-year-old.
That must have
We,
been a close relationship that you can, or still is, I hope. Because it's like you against the world, you two against the world in a way, because,
yeah, or
but I guess you were
against
a
her.
team or something, right? But
Well, yeah, we were a team. So I helped her. So the main thing was figuring out how to do online business in general. We had to develop her business strategy, her logo, the way her videos would
wow, that's so
look, and all that
cool.
jazz.
Were you just
Yeah.
driving around in the RV discussing it all day and then working on it when you stop or something?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
We would do
really?
shifts and have
Wow.
task lists. We're trying to really make it work. But it was a real struggle. And my wife still has her online business, and I still have Brain Inspired. So I guess
It worked.
we kept through it. But I mean, we were struggling financially. Uh,
Of
so
course. I mean,
so
that's,
so then we had to, yeah. That's why partially why I'm back in academia now is a confluence of reasons. We needed more income. Our circumstances, we ended up living in Durango, Colorado after a year and a half traveling around in the RV, and our financial circumstances kind of changed in Durango. We had to figure out, you know, do I get a job? Does she get a job? I guess I'll get a job. What can I do? So I started looking around at academic opportunities, partially because of this boom in deep learning and AI, of which I had learned a lot about now.
yeah.
I hadn't
Hmm.
implemented anything, but I had learned a lot
Hmm.
about it through talking with people, which I'm not
Yeah.
sure. Maybe we can come back to this because I don't know. The podcast world is a little out of control these days but in terms of sort of the self-importance of that podcasts are important. And I don't know how important they are. Maybe you have a position on that.
Gosh, I don't know if any podcaster in particular is necessarily needs to be said as important, but I think that there's something about, and I'm not talking about myself because it's kind of weird, but more I'm thinking of, let's talk about you. You're the guest here.
Okay. All right.
How you were saying, right? When I kind of imagine when you go to a conference or something now, a lot of younger people would know your name, or a lot of the students, and it's a weird world that is changing at this moment and you're a part of it. But I do think there's an importance to you having taken that risk, which was not easy. And I'm not trying to make you into some kind of a hero, but
Sure.
you did at least listen and meet with the person that you loved and think about it. And it doesn't mean that it all worked out perfectly. It sounds like it was quite hard, but it also didn't fail, because that's kind of a precious time from my perspective, that you traveled around with your kids when they were still young enough. There's so much richness about just life that's in that. And that you then also found a way to use what you're interested in, explore it in an authentic way without catering to trying to make it popular, because that probably would have
I mean, I made the
been weird.
best thing that I knew how to
Yeah.
make, and so it would have
Yeah.
been great if it had become super popular. But I just didn't really
Well,
think
but
that
it
was going to
did in
happen.
this world, I think.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
far
In
as
this world,
neuroscience goes, and
right,
that's everyone's famous in their little world these days. That's the
right.
thing.
Yeah, that's
That
true.
So it's all kind of, we're learning, it's a bit relative, but the important thing is, the reason I'm saying the podcasters are important, some of them, right, is because they've become, I think, like the new kind of teachers in a way. And this can be good or bad. But just in your case, what I'm saying is you opened up a forum so that a lot of people in a lot of positions that have since become very important, because we're talking about cognition and mind and consciousness.
Yeah,
And
it's crazy.
yeah, this matters, right? It does. And it matters because the science that gets done today trickles down in some way through whatever popular books, but also through papers and grants and money and experiments. And it influences life, and it influences AI, even though people are saying maybe not so much now, but it does. It influences our technology. It's all connected, right? So I can understand why people would, like, you kind of became a teacher in a way. So teachers are important.
I
Um,
agree with
yeah.
the statement that teachers are important, but it's sort of indirectly teaching by asking people questions and learning about their work at a level that I could kind of keep up with them and just know a few questions that might lead to them saying something interesting and could, teach people about things. Someone told
Yeah.
me I was in, like about a year ago, someone told me I was in science communication, and
Hmm.
it kind of took me by surprise. And I had to say, oh, I guess I kind of am. Do you feel like you're in science communication, philosophy communication?
No, I don't think about it like that. I mean, for me, it's a more of a obsessive curiosity, desire to connect. I just feel like it's something that I have to do, and I like to. I want to give people a way to see that they're not that things connect more than they think, right? Or they're not.
Yeah, I love
It's
that.
okay. It's okay to get past this either or that I've seen stifle a lot of people and stuff, but I think what we're doing is different because I'm really trying. I mean, I'm really thinking of philosophy of mind and really trying to kind of
Yeah,
build a philosophy and trying to do it in a transparent way and trying to do it in a community way instead of me being like, "Oh, here's the philosophy that I've come up with and here it
it's
is."
a
Like,
such a cool project that you're involved in, that you are spearheading because you created it. It's just really, uh, I admire that you're doing it this way.
well, thanks. It just kind of happens, but it feels right to me. It's hard in
Hmm.
a lot of ways, and I'm putting myself out there. But in terms of when you're trying to come up with what an idea of philosophy in mind, I feel like it should be that way, and everyone should be able to just see what's happening and critique it. But to you, I think it's really important what you said about because I said you were a teacher, and you said you're opening up the space, but that's what Socrates did too, right? In a way, it's a lot of the best
Yeah,
teachers learn. You know what they're doing is being students. And somehow you kind of found that format of being a student that's done a lot of homework. And then we get to listen to it and like we don't have to do all the homework, but we get to learn,
hopefully,
right?
if I do it
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
But what I'm getting at is it's fascinating the switch because
What switch?
now the switch of what matters in academia is connected to this because it's becoming more like we were talking about narrowing and you go really deep, and that's still very important too. But we were also
Yeah.
talking about how we need to be able to see how things connect because that's also important for advancements in science and also just like in terms of how we understand technology and all these
Yeah.
things. And so you've kind of come up with you found a way to educate yourself in a way that now universities need people to have been educated. Does that make sense? So what I'm saying is because we are skipping, but you went through what 5, 6 years of trying to build the podcast, trying to survive, raising kids, moving, all this kind of stuff. At the same time, putting out what like almost 200 shows.
Yeah, yeah, nearing 200.
That's gonna be a big one.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if I don't have the bandwidth anymore to make it. I did a whole special for my
Did
100th.
you?
Yeah, there's like a series of them where I asked a lot of previous guests questions, and I put a lot of effort into it. I'm not sure. 200 might just might be a normal episode. We'll see.
Well, that's okay too. It's just it's wonderful that you've gotten 200, and they're all very substantial and yeah, but I guess the point is now in doing that, in doing 200 episodes, it means you've done so much research across so many
Right.
fields. You've connected a lot of dots. And actually, that's what neuroscience needs now, just in terms of how to think about whatever the subject matter is a little bit differently. So it's weird, isn't it? And I guess we can get into it a little bit because I want to know why you decided to go back to school. I know it was also partly financial, but you could have studied philosophy, for example, or philosophy of science.
Well,
Why did you go back into neuroscience and specifically into what you went into? And does it make sense what I'm saying? Do you feel like you have a perspective that's somehow helpful compared to where you were in 2017 or whatever?
yeah. So there's a lot there that you said. Yes, I do, but I get asked that all the time. Like, so what is the perspective now? And it still feels, like, what's the answer now that you have learned so much? And
Oh,
that's
well,
really what a lot of people want to know. And that's a frustrating question to not be able to precisely
I'm definitely
answer.
not asking what the answer is because I don't even know what the question is. I'm more
That's,
thinking, have you learned
yeah,
how to learn better? Have you learned how to ask questions better? It's more the
I
practice
think
of
so.
thinking that I think the patterning of your thinking might have changed in a way that's helpful.
I think so, but I think the proof will be in the pudding as I move along in, back in academia. Part of the reason why I wanted to get back in academia was to see about, if I could use all these new thinking tools and machine learning tools and perspective tools, right? And all of the see how it has affected not just my outlook, but my science. And now my day to day is very much more so mostly like any other neuroscientist these days, depending on what field you're in. I sit in front of a computer and code in order to analyze data. Um, and the questions, because of the advancement of machine learning, the questions that you can ask of the data are a little bit different now than the questions that you could ask before. But we're still mired. That seems like a strong term. We're still very much embroiled in. No, that's negative as well. We're still
Immersed
in the
in?
we're still by sort of the default perspective in computational neuroscience is that computationalism perspective. So it's not like so it's like I've changed, but my surroundings haven't, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people who I could have conversations about these things haven't changed, right? I mean, I remember when I interviewed for my postdoc job, I had to describe what process philosophy was and why I was interested in it and stuff. And I'm
Mm.
not sure if it's changed. It has changed my my interpretation of the data and why it might look the way it looks. So this is kind of hard to describe, but I have a data set now that is messy relative to what a traditional neuroscientific data set would be. And now I can look at that and say, oh, okay, well, it's all like because of the process and it's from ongoing continuous behavior from a mouse, which is messy. And now that I think about things in terms of continuous flow of motion uh, and motor output and from the environment back, into perceptual, and that is just a continuous transformation of energy, right? Is one way to say it. Another way to
Mm-hmm.
say it is that, oh, it's doing computations. But when you look at it as like a continuous transformation of energy, I'm sorry, that's not my favorite phrase either, but I'm going to use it. Then you start to be okay with the fact that things don't look perfect in the data. That the data it can't tell you a perfect story, which
Mm-mm.
we already know.
Yeah.
No model is perfect. All models are wrong. Some are good. Is that the George P. Box
Some are
phrase?
better than others,
Dang it.
maybe.
This is
I
something I
don't
should
know.
have wrote in my mind. Anyway, all models are wrong. Some are more useful. I
Oh,
think that's
yeah,
it.
that sounds better.
Some are useful.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so that's the way I think about modeling these days too. You were mentioning the map and the territory and then getting confused. And I think early on in my career, I was right there being confused by, if you can make a model as good as the data, then that's telling you a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's somewhat conflating. The model isn't real. It's not perfect. It can't be perfect. It's a metaphor. It's a model. So you can use it to try to infer and interpret your data in certain ways, but you're not making the thing. You're actually making a model. You're not making the brain region.
Mm-hmm.
You're making a
Mm-hmm.
model. And I think I used to just kind of accept that if you made the model, you understood. If you could
Yeah.
make a perfectly predictive model, you understood the brain
I think
region
it
or something.
happens all the time that we assume it. Having studied neuroscience, um, an fMRI image, we talk about it as if it's the brain, right? And
Yeah,
instead of a picture of a really parameterized, pixelated, one little tiny thing that's going on, and with a specific, like we just can't hold all that. We just think, oh, that's the brain.
yeah. You
We
say
assume
there
it, and we
is
do it
emotion
all the
right
time.
there. There is emotion, right? And,
Yeah.
and that
And this gets back to trying to hold the paradox and look at it a little bit differently. But because I do really honestly believe that we're at a moment in science where we can finally maybe do that for the first time. However, it's very important we understand that they're just models coming from a particular path, and that needs to be seen. all of that needs to be accounted for in the experiment, in our understanding of the experiment, in the way we talk about it, in the way we use the words. At the moment, it feels way too big to try to do that, but I really think we can, and we're all trying to. And you're kind of bringing that in, is what I'm saying.
Well,
I don't,
yeah.
I don't know how to exactly say it, but you're bringing that into that world, even with just conversations you have or the way you just presented it, right? If you just presented it to that in that way to a few people, it changes a lot in that little environment.
Oh,
I think.
these are the kinds, of course, when anything you learn new that changes your perspective, you think, oh man, if I had only learned that uh, as an undergrad or something, like before, it would have changed my whole perspective. So, I mean, I'm coming at this kind of late also in terms of well, nah, I don't want to say that. I'm just an old man. That's what I'm saying. But um, uh, I feel like you're giving me a lot more credit than I deserve. You're being very kind with your words. Um, but hopefully that's true. And I'm somewhat surprised at your and I'm impressed by your optimism that we might be on the cusp of being able to what you phrase as hold the paradox together. Is that
Well,
but
yeah, just understand the paradox can be what it is. And when you let it do that, you notice patterns in it
right? Okay,
rather than trying to resolve it. Or I think we just assume if it's a paradox, it's like a contradiction, which isn't actually true or something.
right. Yeah, yeah.
You
Well,
can
see,
have the computation, but you can also know that the process itself can never be computed. Those don't have
see,
to mutually cancel each
yeah,
other out.
I understand that, and now that I understand that, it's hard to understand why anyone else would think any differently.
Because you've done so much hard work though, because I think it's very hard it's so nuanced and as you were just saying, it in the same way that like once you know something, you wish you'd known it your whole life, but it's one of those weird things, kind of like your little son when he realized the mind thing. You realize it only one time and then it
Yeah,
seems like it's always been that way. And this is another one of those moments, I think, where we just haven't articulated it in our science in a way that it's kind of shifted widely in that sense. I do think it's happening. Like I really think there's been so much annoying debate about the word representation for good reason.
yeah.
Um,
From philosophers mostly.
from philosophers, but from neuroscientists too.
Yes, it's
And
true. It's true. Yeah,
everybody's kind of in it. And yeah, it's the same, right? Of course we have representations and they're real, but the brain is a process, right? So it's still even hard to talk about it, but these are hard things. But I do feel like we're trying to do that a bit and getting there. I can
well,
see it.
you're doing that work, so that's, I
So are
mean,
you.
that is, but you're doing it on like intentionally. I'm sort of doing
Yeah.
it as yeah.
I'm trying
I
to
mean,
articulate it literally, which is, yeah,
yeah, I'm
why
trying
I'm
to
doing all
articulate
this.
it in my own head.
But you're also doing it. I'm
Yeah,
really not trying to put you on a pedestal and give you a lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
credit. I've
yeah,
just seen it in labs. This doesn't get seen, but little things like a couple conversations where people just suddenly make that little switch. I keep thinking of your
yeah.
son where you just, the light goes off. And if that
Yeah,
happens in a few labs around the world right now, it's a big switch, right? And I think your podcast does that. And I imagine you do that in whatever context you're in because that's who you are now. You have this path. But
right.
I, yeah.
Yeah, going back to that realization that that you can hold the paradox. It's almost like what you just realize. Oh, it's okay. It's like it eases the burden of
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
think about it in one way or the other, and to realize, oh, it's all one thing and just different. I mean, perspectivalism is a popular word these days,
Yeah.
pluralism, and it's all part of accepting different viewpoints as explanations from different perspectives, and that they're all like valid, not all, but you can have multiple seemingly contradicting things that
Yeah.
people assume are dichotomies that are living actually together, and it's such a freeing feeling.
It is such a freeing feeling. I think of it sometimes like as a landscape or in a more general sense, because if you take a landscape or a mountain, for example, there's many ways you could explore that mountain and you're going to see very different things, but you could go to the same kind of place And I think models can be like that. That's different than saying, oh, all the models can be true. No. What's the question? And then you critique which model might be best. And then you go through all that rigorous stuff too.
Yep. I mean, you still have to do the hard science, but
Yeah.
it's with the background in your head, it's like much easier to proceed even if you don't feel like you're in a fight with the concepts.
Right. That's what I was hearing when you were talking about the way you look at the data now. Instead of, because we often talk about trying to fit the data to the model, but maybe you can, again, it's very hard. I think that's of that quote of Fitzgerald that I love, of the sign of intelligence is being able to hold two opposing ideas at once and, I
Oh,
don't know, not go
yeah,
crazy or something like that, because it is kind of hard to look at all that data and then you can understand, okay, if I let it be a little bit loose, there's a lot of different models that I could find here and that I could use with the data. And then maybe choosing one and going with it. But there's something about being able to hold the space and let it be one model among what could be many that might fit. I
that's
don't know.
right. And in the end, you're going to be telling a story either way.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
whatever and so how you frame that story can affect how people interpret your results, right? But it's still a story about how we think things work. And something can be super predictive, and then something else can add like a slightly different take on it, a slightly different bent on the way, and not be as predictive, but it can still add to the story. Um, I have trouble articulating these things as well, so I'm glad you're doing it. And I look forward to your book coming out so that maybe that can help me do that better.
Yeah, thanks. But I think you do it very well in your conversations and
Thank
so
you.
on. And it's a reservoir, right? Where people can go and get a lot of this without having to talk about it directly because it's in there.
But let me just say, so you were, at my place of work now, or
Yeah.
just running into the average neuroscientist, it's still very much the default assumption that we all think the same way and that there is the correct way to think. And it is this one, not that one. And so that, that has not changed. So among my podcast audience, perhaps it has, but they are diluted across, the world. So
Diluted, not diluted. Yeah. It sounded like you
yeah.
said there. Yeah.
Oh,
No, but still that's how it starts. And these things seem not to exist and then they change and it's as if it always was that way. I really just think it's a different kind of assumption. It's a different assumed starting point and it's hard to get there, but I think like we're all trying to get there in a certain way. And we were talking about podcasts and everyone has their podcast and I see it as in a way, a good way. I think we're at a moment where everyone's kind of doing it, but as it's very hard to do. And it's not like
yeah.
you
Yeah.
don't, unless you just become, you have to have millions and millions of followers to make money because it's not
You have to
about,
almost already be a celebrity.
yeah, yeah. People
Yeah.
think you're getting rich or something, but it's really, you have to do it because you want to do
Oh
it.
yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
So I think
Unless you are a
people
celebrity.
get,
Yeah.
yeah, or there's some motivation behind it. But
Right.
I guess what I was going to say is that maybe that's part of what we're talking about too, is that's also opening up a way for us to be able to open the space a little bit and communicate a bit differently in our kind of
Mm.
assumed starting place when it comes to science. Because yeah, there's also a lot of motivation in there, isn't there? I'm thinking of philosophy where, you want to debate and fight and so on. So
That seems to be the majority of philosophy, which is kind of a turn off. I really enjoy
yeah.
philosophy for a couple paragraphs, and then you kind of get lost in the nitpickiness of definitions, and the philosophers can work their way around any topic any way they want, it seems. So that they're just, good rhetoric, just the path you choose, and then you just kind of are back where you started, and then you're going to argue again about representation the next day and the next day and the next day. And so that gets a little, that wears me down a little bit.
That's why you
But I
didn't go into philosophy.
maybe, but uh, I did think about going into philosophy instead of going back into neuroscience. But I thought I would have to get like another PhD. I would have to get another degree. It'd be like starting all over. And that wouldn't be enough income either on a like a
Mhm.
graduate school stipend and stuff. So that factored into it as well. But I'm still interested. Maybe I'll go back at some point.
Yeah, you could probably do it online in a way from
Oh
some
yeah,
school.
that's true.
When
That's
I
true.
first heard you say you were going back into academia, I thought you were going to be a consultant or something, be in the lab which is the philosophical role anyway. So who knows as it progresses, because you're still doing the podcast and academia is
Yeah.
changing and everything's changing. So who knows how it all evolves.
Well, yeah, they had to invent a new title for my position because
Oh,
of technicalities of like my experience, and that it was a weird thing. But I would love to be a consultant. I just don't know that it exists yet.
I think in practice it definitely does. And that's
Hmm.
what a lot of philosophers do in labs. So in a way,
Is
you're
that
already
is that
doing that.
is that
Yeah.
becoming more popular to have a philosopher consultant in
I mean,
your
they wouldn't use
science
the
lab?
word consulting, but yeah, I think it's like that because that's what you bring. Like you were just talking about the how philosophers are such good critical thinkers. So you learn that skill. And
Yeah.
then what happens is if you stay in a philosophy department, you just argue endlessly about
Endlessly, right?
stuff that doesn't matter to
Right,
show how
right.
great of an arguer you are. And it's kind of exciting and titillating and all that, but you can just end up going around and around in loops. But I think, and that's, I'm not trying to completely disparage that, but it can
No,
become that.
and it can progress things. It's just not part of the philosophy world I am interested in pursuing, right?
And the real, when it comes to the subjects we're talking about, consciousness, cognition, mind, trying to understand what this is and all the implications, that we need each other in various fields. And to speak to all these subjects we're talking about, what a philosopher can do. A philosopher, in that sense, is someone who can think critically or who's looked at a lot of different paths and arguments and can then, so in a lab, you can more or less, like your best contribution is to have easily a way to think through all those different paths, which is what I'm saying you've learned how to do with your podcast. Saying, well, we could look at it this way or this way or this way. And did you know about this and this study? Because I find a lot of times people are doing redundant work or they're doing
Of course.
work that would connect perfectly with someone else if only they had ever heard of that person.
Yeah, that happens more and more because there's more and more science being done as well. Yeah, that's a problem. I mean, you need replication, but you don't want to be redundant in science.
And from your position, you probably would catch a lot more of that stuff.
I would hope so. And I think I've become more fluid in terms of being able to uh, think between perspectives
Mm-hmm.
without too much pain because it's still hard and there's still friction in terms of doing that. I think that that's one of the more valuable things is just being allowing myself to entertain more perspectives. Yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
hopefully
That's
that's
what I've noticed in your podcast. And also
um,
that you're not afraid to make people a little bit uncomfortable, which is important. You,
that's a fine line. I don't know how you feel about that because one of the early criticisms that I would get is that I'm not tough enough
oh,
on the
okay.
people, but I want mostly to highlight their work. I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to I don't want it to be a gotcha moment
No,
kind
no,
of
that's not fun.
podcast.
That's not what I mean at all. I don't, that wouldn't make any sense for your podcast. What
Not for
I
mine,
mean
but
more that
yeah.
you've read it so deeply and that
Yeah.
you, if you don't understand something, you're not afraid to say, what about this? That kind of a
Oh,
discomfort where they have to actually explain it. And sometimes it's, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. Because that's what we need, right? A way when
yeah.
people can do that in a way that's not trying to do the gotcha moment, because that is not beneficial
Well,
in my.
that's one thing that has only increased throughout my career is knowing how little I know and being super comfortable because I know no one knows anything. And so I'm okay by vocalizing, I have no idea of what you're talking about. And I'm super comfortable with that. So I don't know if that's, yeah, I don't know what that's related to. It's more,
Well,
that's more like just showing people that it's okay to not know something,
yeah. I think
I
that's
guess.
part of the benefit of the podcast too, is that you can show people that being a lifelong student is okay. In a
Hmm.
weird way, that's what we're all trying to learn because I'm sure you've probably noticed it too. I don't know about if we go back to your early years in academia, but when you do kind of make it into academia and it's never or science, often, of course, it's still very inspiring and amazing, but there's usually a moment, like there's those moments like you described of kind of, whoa, you're part of something incredible. And then there's also moments where you're like, oh, these are just like normal people making mistakes, doing normal
Trying their
stuff.
best,
Nobody knows
mostly,
anything.
yeah, mostly trying their best.
Yeah.
But also, I, this has to be true of all fields. But I have met so many amazing, generous, kind people in academia, not just smart. Of course, there's a lot of smart people too, but those don't often those don't always go hand in hand. And so I've just met so many people I've just enjoyed so much, and I feel so lucky to have gotten to know and interact with, and whom I feel are, going to be lifelong friends at this point.
I think that's beautiful that you said that. There are some incredible people, and it's so motivating when you come
Yeah.
across them. And it's
Yeah.
so inspiring. Just someone who you just can't believe how much they're giving and how good they are, and nobody even sees it and they don't need the recognition. And it seems like nobody sees that, but when I really look at academia, I think that's what's keeping it going, and that's really at the heart of all those big discoveries, even if the person who gets pinned with the discovery sometimes isn't doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to temper that also with, of course, like in any other area, there's so much politics involved, and not backstabbing, but massaging things to get your view in the spotlight, and trying to seem right more than trying to be right. And so I should have said that at first and then ended with the super positive thing instead of ending with the dark side, right?
No, but it is there. But that's
Yeah.
what I meant by that's the stuff that you, even in current politics, it might seem like the kind of sexy stuff or the stuff that's powerful. But when you really start looking at it, you realize the real power is actually something else,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to just life quality, to sort of move towards back to your life and towards kind of wrapping up this talk for today, at least. That feeling that you're describing and that motivation, I wonder, I know this word love isn't like an easy word to talk about, but when I just having listened to your podcast now for years, and I feel like it's motivating you, whether it's with you and your wife making these big decisions, or whether it's the way you talk about your kids, even though you're very funny, but it's very clear you love your kids a lot. And,
Oh.
but also the way you respect your guests and that you've created this community and so on. I know we don't want to talk about that word too much in connection to all this, but like,
Do you get a lot of pushback from other guests on this?
I think it's hard to talk about.
It is
I
hard to
don't get
talk about.
pushback. It's hard to talk about. And I think I'm actually very careful about it because I want us to recognize it doesn't even have to be the word love, but even just connection, human. I don't want it to get too saccharine where it's, because I find love to be quite like uncomfortable at times and a harder thing. Like it has
Are
an
you talking about
edge to it.
a feeling of love or an act of love?
Well, how do you think of love? As
I
a
can sit
process?
I can sit with different paradoxical views of it, right? Because then, and on the one hand, I think I grew up assuming that love was something one felt. And as I get older and have done, had children, it doesn't matter how you feel, it's what you do. And so I've shifted to at least include love as a behavior or action,
Hmm.
like a loving action. And I tend to lean toward that over the feeling itself, because you can have a feeling and nothing will be different, right?
Well,
You
we
can
could
have,
go into all kind of neuroscience and philosophy on that one. Like, what's the difference between the
I don't
feeling and the
know,
action and the mind and action and all this? And I guess, like, to
right?
summarize, we would say we hold the paradox, right, after this conversation. But,
Yeah.
but what I do want to dig into it just a little bit because the feeling we're fed in media that of what love is, where you really feel this kind of everything is good in the world or something. I
Yeah.
don't think that's necessarily the feeling of love all the time. For me, because to be honest, even as a kid, love has been a when I feel love, I almost feel pain because you can't do anything about it. You just have to feel it. If like with the kids, right? You can't do anything about it. You just got to be with it, and it's painful in a way. And yes, you have to acting out of that is the real love. But yeah, so what do you mean by the feeling of love?
Oh, the feel, like meeting, watching my children being born, meeting and getting to know my wife, and that gut kind of visceral
Yeah,
tingling
yeah.
sensation that your thoughts gets right, like your current situation
When it, yeah.
gives rise to. And so that's kind of what I mean by, and then realizing, oh, like I really, like really love this person. And so that's the sort of the feeling or realization. Or recently, a little over a year ago, my grandfather died, and I was he'd been bedridden in the hospital, and he was really going downhill. I'm sorry, I don't mean for this to be a morbid tale,
No, no,
but
it's not.
he did the thing where he like people had gone and visited him and I hadn't been able to make it yet. He did the thing where he waited for me before he
Oh,
died, you know? Like
oh,
that's my
wow.
interpretation. I know there are other, but that's what everyone has said. And I know that from, nursing home situations that happens quite
Oh,
frequently.
yeah.
So I got there, I got to say goodbye to him. I was the last person to see him alive. I hung out with
Mm.
him, for a couple hours in the night, and he died, uh, an hour or two after I left.
Oh God, Paul.
So he was
Wow.
dead the next morning. And I say that like, so I don't know what that is from his perspective, but I felt such love. And I felt such love for him also, as a grandfather, as a man, as a human being, really. He was a very kind, generous, funny man. But I felt that connection between he and I as well. And so that's
Yeah.
another feeling of love.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's very beautiful, and it actually speaks to a lot of what I was trying to express, but not so well, because there's your grandfather, right? He has there's no motivating factor for him to do that other than
Oh, he was
love.
not
Or
in a great situation. And you're right that it is accompanied by a sort of crushing feeling, right? It almost
that's the
destroys you
word.
in
That's
some
the word.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I really felt that at times where even the
Yeah.
love for your grandfather, in my case, my grandmother, and she's been gone. I don't know if you still think about your grandfather a lot, but my grandmother passed away, but I still have it sometimes where it's just so, I cannot believe how much I love this person who's not even in the world anymore, but
Yeah.
there's a continuity.
Oh, I was just crying a couple nights ago about it. Just sitting with just the reflection and thinking about the person. And if it's not just my grandfather, I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah.
Um, but
You can't get away from it.
no,
There's some meaning in there. There's some, even when it's painful, there's some feeling of life, real meaning and real, you don't care about your legacy, but you have a legacy, right? And so these
sure.
things you're creating and your relationship with your grandfather, how that's going to be transmitted into your kids, like you have no choice. It's happening.
Yeah, I'll go along with that.
You don't have to. Do you
No,
disagree?
I mean, I think you do have a choice, right? To act differently. You don't have maybe a
The
choice of how you
action is a
feel, but
choice.
the feeling, perhaps not. But I mean, it's a cycle, right? When you act a certain way, it's going to potentially dictate your feelings as well. So maybe
Actually, that's an
there's,
important
uh,
point. Yeah. Okay. Was
no,
there
that's
anything
okay.
we haven't said that needs to be said, or any
I don't
final
think
things?
so. I've really appreciated the conversation. Slightly painful in a very good way at times, but I
Well,
appreciate your interest and your gratitude. I mean, you said a lot of nice things about what I'm doing, and I feel a lot of gratitude for your
yeah,
appreciation. Thank you, Andrea. Keep me posted about your book and how your
I
work's
will.
going. I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. Have a good day, and thanks for being patient and staying on.